Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Eliathambi. Well, following the disaster of Cyclone Ditwa, a group of 121 global scholars publicly urged that Sri Lanka's debt repayments be postponed, as it is predicted that the country will be hard-pressed to meet its fiscal targets. I am pleased to have in our studio this evening one of those scholars, Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura. Good evening and welcome back to the show, Kanchana.
Thank you, Niresh, for having me here.
Right.
Good to be back.
So, Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura is a professor of development geography at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. She is renowned as a feminist scholar who has carried out much notable research on current topics related to global development. These range from global debt distress to global production processes, labor, ethical trade, and post-disaster conflict and post-conflict development politics. She is a co-founder of the Institute of Political Economy Sri Lanka, and she specializes in research on Sri Lanka and the global south. She holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge. So, Kanchana, you have been on our show several times previously. I think somewhere around February this year, you were on one of our shows, and we did discuss various matters related to the fiscal situation. And now the situation has changed. We all know that Cyclone Ditwa hit the country very hard, but the statement by the 121 scholars took many people by surprise because it's not easy to get so many global scholars together to speak in one voice and practically demand that the global community should come to the aid of Sri Lanka. And these are scholars from all over the world. A few are Sri Lankan, such as yourself, but they are from dozens of different countries. So tell me, what was the thought process behind this statement? And academics don't usually put out statements like this. They usually do research and, they'll speak about it in conferences and write journal articles and so on, and books, of course. But they don't usually come out with such a dramatic statement. So what was the thinking behind this?
So thank you, Niresh, again for having me here. It's good to be back. I think we spoke earlier this year, as you mentioned. So our thinking when we kind of drafted this statement together with Professor Jayati Ghosh, Debt Justice UK, and ourselves, we were kind of looking at what was the debate in Sri Lanka, and we found, it was like we thought the debate was quite rather limiting, right? The focus was on, how do we repay our debt, but not thinking of any other kind of alternatives that we could consider. There is a global debate going on, both more generally. This is not about Sri Lanka, this is about the global south more generally, because as we know, the UNDP has pointed out, there are 53 other countries which is going through global debt distress, at least since 2022. So there's a global debate going on, which kind of asks questions on whether the current global financial architecture is really fit for purpose in terms of meeting the dire needs of countries. Climate shock is one of them. And in Sri Lanka, we know that the debt sustainability analysis, or the DSA, which was done after 2022, really didn't consider climate shocks, right? So we want to kind of broaden that debate. And although peculiarly as these debates exist globally, but it's almost as if in Sri Lanka that it doesn't percolate enough, I feel, almost, right? I feel that. And we want to kind of bring people who are at the forefront of these debates, who are pushing for this at the UN, in terms of at the IMF meetings and the World Bank meetings. We want to kind of bring them together to kind of point out, well, here's tragically a case study almost, where we should be kind of telling the IMF and the World Bank, the IMF in particular in this instance, to kind of reconsider the deal that the country was left with. And so that really motivated us to draft the statement. We had obviously had enough momentum because we drafted this statement beginning of December, and we got the signatures within about 2 weeks. And then the Guardian picked it up, I believe, on the 21st of December, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So yeah, that was the process behind it, really. And it was ready to get Sri Lanka to think about that there's a wider debate, and we need to be attentive to that.
Right. And now, why is it that this type of disaster is not included in these global financial instruments? Because yes, the country is trying to repay its debts, and of course it's a struggle. We know this. The austerity measures that came about under the last two governments were quite severe. Increased taxes and lower spending, social spending, and so on. And then, of course, there was the massive inflation, and people lost jobs and so on because of the economic growth went into recession, actually. So with all this, the country is still trying to make its payments, and yes, there was debt restructuring, but clearly we can't withstand any kind of shock. And this isn't just Sri Lanka. I mean, if it were any other country, it's the same situation. In fact, I think Sri Lankans are actually far more resilient than most countries, most peoples. But why is it that this hasn't been considered in the past? Because cyclones happen all the time. Earthquakes happen all the time. There are so many natural disasters.
Yeah, at one level I would, I think this question probably needs to go back to the previous government and the IMF, who was negotiating the agreement in principle just before this new government came into power. And it's a valid question. It's not just the climate shock, it's any kind of external shock. So we know, for instance, that Trump's tariffs caused quite a bit of havoc in the country, especially for the garment sector in the country.
Absolutely.
Right? That too is an external shock, right? When it comes to climate change, from my limited knowledge, the IPCC has Sri Lanka as one of the at high risk countries for climate change and climate disasters.
Yes, indeed.
And so it's really a question of why then didn't the IMF account for things like climate change, account for any other kind of external shocks, and instead came up with a debt sustainability analysis that was, worked with very narrow parameters, right? And so this is why the country is in a far more acute place. So at the moment we pay something like 25% of our revenue goes towards debt repayments. But that's just interest. It's not even the principal, right? So that question is something that needs to go back to the IMF, and the current government has the opportunity in many ways, because I think there's a meeting coming up in January, if I'm not
That's right.
If
the
I'm
IMF
not wrong.
Meeting is coming up.
And I also recall Brad Setzer, who is from the Council of Foreign Relations, when he did a YouTube webinar. He actually said every meeting with the IMF is a point of negotiation, right? And the meetings in January should be a point of serious negotiations, given the impacts of Cyclone Ditwa on the Sri Lankan, the people, the infrastructure, the economy, right? The kind of really ask, is the sustainability analysis that was done for Sri Lanka fit for purpose now, given what we know? That's one question. The second question would be, or it's not a question, the second bit of work that the government has to do is it really needs to kind of request for a pause on the debt repayments and use that time to kind of do its own independent debt sustainability analysis. And this doesn't mean the government or the state itself has to do it. It could mean the government, looks outside and gets external support to do that kind of work, because there are other countries who have done this work, right? So it is really kind of reaching out and drawing on the expertise to do this work and make it independent, but use all these broaden the parameters than what exists right now.
Right. So just to explain to our viewers what a DSA is, debt sustainability analysis, what it actually means. Would you be able to give our viewers a little bit of an idea?
So, in layperson speak, I think it would essentially mean to kind of analyze the debt stock we owe, and including bilaterals, bondholders, all of that, and kind of come up with a plan as to how we are going to pay back what we owe, right? And that analysis in 2020, between 2022 and now, what was done had a 17% reduction or a debt cancellation, but this is the smallest that I know of. Ghana, for instance, had 37% debt reduction, debt cancellation. Zambia had 21.6% debt reduction. In Sri Lanka's case, it was 17%, which is pretty low in contrast. So it's about kind of reducing the debt we owe. I mean, there's a debt cancellation or there's debt relief. That would be another language, or the other commonly used language is haircut amongst the kind of economic community. You take that, then you reduce that amount, and then you talk about how do you repay this and what kind of shifts do you take. So the austerity policies or increasing electricity prices, for instance, is part of that conversation or of that analysis of that equation, right? That would be, in very simple terms, that would be one way of putting it.
So it's the debts and the reduction in debts and our capacity
to repay.
Yeah. And of course, our capacity would be affected. I mean, you can't, yes, economists try to predict the future, but you really, it's a hit and miss game, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, a war breaks out somewhere, perhaps in the Middle East, the oil prices spike.
No, external shock,
that's something you can't predict it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even have to be in the Middle East. I mean, when the Ukraine war started,
it affected us. Yeah.
So these things happen, and it could be a natural disaster in the U.S., which is our main market for apparels. So where the whole world is interconnected. It boggles the mind that this is not included in the original agreement.
It is, but we also have to keep in mind that original agreement was, I think if I recall correctly, the presidential elections were held in September 21st, 2024.
Yes, that's
somewhere
correct.
Around that point. And both the previous president and the IMF kind of hastily came to an agreement in principle, which bound the new government and the new president's hands almost, right? So the IMF talks about good governance. Certainly that wasn't an illustration of good governance as far as I'm concerned, right? When there's an election coming up, which is about, the mandate of the democratic mandate of the people, you don't try to, bind the hands of a newly elected government. But that's really what happened. But that's something that happened in the past. We need to be now thinking about, we are in this moment. We've, 1 month later from Cyclone Ditwa, coming up to 1 month later, we've had this catastrophe where the World Bank, a conservative estimate is 4.1 billion is the impact on the physical damage, right, to buildings, the infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and the agricultural sector. So there is a conservative estimate. I have seen some estimates saying as much as 7 billion, right?
And that's just to repair things, to bring it back to what it was, which is not what we need.
That too. But so that doesn't account for the loss of livelihoods. It doesn't account for that. It's just really focusing on the physical infrastructure, right? We know that has happened. So the government now really needs to now it's incumbent upon this government, and also I would say on Parliament, to be holding the government to account. This involves the opposition, and kind of really pressing them to negotiate or ask for a debt suspension and start doing their homework to come up with an agreement where we can repay the debt. We, have a debt repayment plan that is manageable, that reflects the current reality that we are working with, right? I mean, there is at one level little point in kind of thinking about what happened in 2024. We need to be using this moment in a way that kind of really promotes the economic sovereignty of the country, that is about, citizens who are affected by this, right? Especially in terms of livelihoods, but also, the national kind of railroads, the roads, all of this is affected. So this will have an impact on the economy, not just in terms of food sovereignty and food security. It is going to have an effect of that because of the impact on agriculture, but that is a conversation this government has to take up, right? It's incumbent upon them, I would actually say. And this also involves, Professor Jayati Ghosh, one of the colleagues who we worked with, in fact, it's on one of your programs, the People's Platform, she actually said, we need to come up with a debt sustainability plan analysis where we pay back based on our export earnings rather than on our GDP, which is not in dollars. Our GDP is in rupees, right? So that would be one shift, for instance, right? But this is work the government has to do. We, like IPE or some of these global scholars working outside, what we can do is to kind of say, this is the pathways that you all should be taking. But the government has to be kind of saying, okay, map that out for us, do an independent DSA, for instance. But the government has to sanction that, right? We can only kind of say, look, you all have to seriously consider alternatives. And this is also goes to the IMF, of course, to be, to have the interest of the people of the country at heart, and not just about the macroeconomic indicators or our ability to repay the creditors, not make that the priority, which is what is happening. This is not just Sri Lanka again. This is IMF's priority for all other indebted countries, right? But it's the government's job to push the IMF as well.
Right. Now, you quite rightly said that we can't really dwell on the past, and, 2024 and the previous government and all that.
Yeah.
But the failure to do our own DSA independently is a glaring omission from back then.
Yeah.
And now this is the opportunity to do one.
Yeah.
In fact, the opportunity has been there. It is actually a necessity to do a DSA now, don't you think?
It is, and it is at one level it's a glaring omission that Sri Lanka didn't do its independent debt sustainability analysis. It is also, I think, a reflection of the fact that for 4 decades at least, there has been institutional decay in our state sector, right? There has been politicization of the state sector. There has been corruption in the state sector. And this means sometimes some of our highly capable people also migrate. We know this, right? They migrate. So we also probably, have limited expertise to do this, right? And when you're in a bind like that, then it is about, it's about internationalism. It's about kind of, moving, kind of doing your homework to assess who can we get the support from and to request that support, right? So this is work, that needs to be done. And yes, I would acknowledge this government, it's been dealt a very bad hand on the one hand, right? It had 2/3 majority, but it came with a really, a massively bad inheritance, and compounded by now a climate shock, which, we should be aware of, because climate change is very real. It's happening all over the world. And we need to be planning, keeping those things in account, right? Not assume that ideal scenario, not work with ideal scenario, but work with the more realistic scenarios, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And now you spoke about the fact that we may not have the expertise within the country to do a proper DSA. But may I put it to you that that is so in many spheres. We didn't have the expertise to build expressways,
Right.
to build airports. We bring in the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans,
Exactly.
the Indians, without batting an eyelid. We do it.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're not like North Korea, which doesn't allow
No,
anyone
totally.
in. We are
Totally.
very international.
Yeah.
So it's no big deal to bring in a set of experts from outside
Absolutely.
to do this for us.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the signatories to this statement is Martin Guzman, who's a former Argentinian finance minister. He's also an economist, one of Joseph Stiglitz's students, Columbia academic. You know, he's done this for Argentina, for instance, right? So the expertise exists internationally, right? And as you point out, we should be, we bring in the expertise from outside. I mean, this is partly the fact that, we have a particular kind of a history where we've been open to, and we need to capitalize it in ways that's beneficial for the country, right? And I'm talking really, when I say the country, I'm actually talking about the people of the country, the working class communities of the country, the low income groups of the country. They have been feeling the effects of the debt crisis hardest, and that's only just been compounded in parts of the country, in vast parts of the country, I would say, with Cyclone Ditwa, right? So, yeah, I mean, and this is also about the government then being able to deliver on its mandate. In its manifesto, it's very clear about changing, system change, about changing the social contract. For us to change the social contract, we've got to be looking at the economy and the way the economy has been shaped with the agreement a year ago, and kind of really analyzing it in much more detail and holding the IMF to accountable as well, right? Because the mandate is with the government, it's not with the IMF.
That's
right?
correct.
And so then it is the government's responsibility to be articulating that position, that it has a mandate to deliver, but it has a mandate to deliver given the fact that the DSA done by the previous government that this government inherited is really limiting, and the Cyclone Ditwa has kind of underlined that.
Right. We need to take a short break now. I'm in conversation with Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura. Don't go away because there's lots more to come. We'll be right back.
ABC Australia is hosting the Party of the Year, and you're invited.
Are you ready?
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am in conversation with Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura. Professor Kanchana, we were talking about the need to do a DSA. Now, there's no issue with doing one, is there? There's no shame in doing it. There's we don't lose anything by doing one. It's simply what is it? Bureaucracy, foolish pride, a lack of understanding that we should have done this? I mean, all of that, I think, because it's been 3 years now since 2022, and we should have done one back then in 2022 and 23 and 24 and now 25. So it's almost 4 years. So we don't lose anything by doing one.
No, I mean, to my mind, no. I think there is a fear, certainly among certain think tanks, because it was difficult to bring some of the creditors onto the table. I think there is a fear that if we do one, some of that would be unraveled. But the reality is, doing an independent DSA is what the IMF would usually expect an indebted country to do. So there is nothing that a country, there is nothing precluding a country, any country, it doesn't have to be Sri Lanka, any indebted country to do their own independent DSA. So Sri Lanka can very well do one. Sri Lanka should be really asking for that. This is what the statement was hoping for, is to kind of ask for a pause in repayment so that it can do its serious homework, reach out internationally if the government wanted to. And as you have pointed out, we have brought in expertise from different parts of the world at different times in our kind of development history, right? So there's nothing that precludes it. So the government, it is the government's responsibility in a sense to be looking at this work seriously, but it's not an anomaly to be doing an independent DSA. It might seem that I think the opportunity is there. Cyclone Ditwa is the opportunity, because Sri Lanka is it's a test case of, where climate and debt have overlapped each other within a period of 3 years. In fact, it's probably none of us expected that, right? Nobody probably expected that, but it has happened. So now that it has happened, the case for having an independent DSA accounting for all these external shocks. Climate is just one, as you pointed out. It could be oil shocks. We know in the past year, in the tariffs, the shock that it created, that those kind of shocks need to be accounted for in an independent DSA. Then conversations on further debt reduction, rescheduling the debt payments, considering things like, do we connect our debt repayment to foreign exchange earnings? These are like serious conversations we should be having. And I think it's important that we put that in the forefront of the government's agenda, right?
Now, the IMF has never told us not to do a DSA.
Not to the best of my knowledge.
They're perfectly fine with it. They would never tell us not to do it.
No, I can see why.
So it's up to us to get it done.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Right. And it's almost like if you have a serious illness and you go to a doctor and he gives you his opinion, he or she, and then it's something serious, and you do go to another doctor or a specialist and get a second opinion. That's quite normal.
Absolutely. Excellent analogy, because I think most people in Sri Lanka would be able to appreciate that, and I think it's what most people would do. You would get a second opinion if you had a serious diagnosis, right? Which is concerning, and that's where Sri Lanka is at. So there is nothing to preclude the government from doing it. The IMF shouldn't be precluding it, because there is nothing, from what I know, where it says you can't do your own independent DSA. I also remember when the crisis happened and IPE didn't exist in the form it does now, but the work we were doing, and we were having these public conversations, people like Isaac Tivan, and Bhat Ghosh, they were making the case, do your own independent DSA. Because
now, how long does it take to do an independent DSA? It's not something which takes years. It
doesn't take years. My sense is, and this is based on conversations we've had with Martin Guzman, I think it would take about 6 months. This is my sense.
Right, to do a thorough one.
Yeah, because they need a lot of information in real time almost, and they kind of use that to do that work.
Right, but much of that information is there.
It should. It should be there with the government, yes, with the different government departmental agencies.
Right, especially with all that's gone on in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
The central bank, the finance ministry, everybody's used to having this data and giving it.
Yeah.
Right. Now, you mentioned something interesting, that Sri Lanka is a test case where indebtedness and climate disasters have combined, overlapped. And it's almost as though the whole world would be watching us, wouldn't they? What is the resolution of this situation? Because whatever happens here with our debt can be expected in other countries as well, perhaps, in a certain way. We are setting a precedent, aren't we?
Yeah, we are setting a precedent to kind of show that the countries, that the countries need to be making the case with the IMF, right? If it comes up with an independent debt sustainability analysis and shows the IMF, this is how we are going to repay. These are the parameters we've taken into consideration. Then it is showing the IMF, here's how we are going to pay it back over whatever period of time, right? And it's a test case, but I think it is a test case in that sense, and it matters because the way the global financial architecture works right now, it doesn't work in the interest of most sovereign countries. It works in the interest of the creditors, the financial interests, right? And we need to be if we are serious about system change, if we are serious about delivering to the citizens and the people, if we are serious about protecting the interest and the rights of people, if we are serious about social protection, we need to have the resources to do all of this work. So the independent DSA also opens up the pathways to do that work, right? And really, if you think about the fact that Ghana got a 37% haircut, right? Sri Lanka got 17%, so almost 20% less. So one can assume that the Ghanaian government did their homework much more robustly than the Sri Lankan government did at that particular point in time. But it doesn't mean that this government can't do its homework, be robust about it, and then go have serious negotiations with the IMF, right? This is my sense.
Now, you mentioned several countries like Ghana, Argentina, Ecuador, and so on. Did the government of Sri Lanka, the previous one, did that regime talk to any of these other countries and ask for their advice on, because they've gone through it?
Yeah.
Some of them, like Ghana, have done very well, others not so well. So did we try to learn from those experiences?
My sense is not, only because
I didn't see any Sri Lankan teams going off to Ghana or Ecuador.
I don't think, because we
them coming here.
Is it Lazard? I think we kind of handed the work
Clifford
over.
Chance and Lazard.
Yeah, we handed the work over to Clifford Chance and Lazard. And as my colleague Charit Gunawardena said, these companies of that nature have a conflict of interest, because on the one hand, they're working in some cases for the creditors, on the other hand for the governments. So my sense is the government went with whatever that Clifford Chance and Lazard came up with. I don't recall any news items which was talking about having these international delegations come here or us going there. And actually, in these days, you don't even have to travel. You do it through Zoom. You just kind of make the connections and have these meetings through Zoom. I mean, this is, if you think about this statement that we put out, most of it was just done by email based on contacts that has been, existed for a while, but that which we've kept nurturing.
Right.
It was really, Zoom meetings, emails. That's it, right? But the government doesn't need to send delegations. It can, it can simply kind of request for Zoom meetings, have several Zoom meetings, and get, provide the necessary information to the relevant, bodies that do this kind of work, independent bodies, and get the work done. You really don't need to be jetting anymore, and we shouldn't be jetting a lot more given climate change alone.
So you didn't actually get 121 experts into one room to sign
exactly
this.
Not at all.
Right.
Not at all.
And one would assume that our central bank people and our finance ministry people would have met their colleagues in these other countries
At some point, one would
at
hope.
various conferences and
Yeah.
seminars and so on. So they wouldn't be absolute strangers either.
Yeah, shouldn't be. Yeah.
Right. So it shouldn't be that difficult. So that's another road that even now we can go down that road and get some advice perhaps.
Yeah, get advice or even seriously considering getting a team. Case in point, Argentina, or the other one would be Ecuador, getting a team from there to work together with, the relevant civil servants here, because it's also about building our own capacity, right? I think that's equally important, right? So instead of kind of, outsourcing the work completely, get people to work together so that the local cadre here learns, they know what needs to be done. They work with economists who have done this work in the past, but it's work that the government has to do. We can only point out the fact that this is work that the government needs to be government needs to be considering, right?
Right.
IPE doesn't have the mandate of the people. The government has the mandate of the people, right? So I think that's super important to keep that in mind.
Right. And of course, we all know that the government has very little cash to spend.
Yeah.
Because as you said, 25% of it is going in interest payments,
Yeah,
and then we have a bloated state sector.
Yeah.
The salaries take up a huge chunk more, and there's very little to actually spend on disaster, response like this to rebuild.
Yeah.
And we absolutely need every cent that we can get out of this. So it's to the advantage of everyone, including the government, to try to push this repayment a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's understandable, isn't it?
It should be. I mean, I can't see how the IMF wouldn't be able to understand it.
Right.
Because their own DSA didn't account for this kind of climate shocks. A climate shock has happened on top of a highly indebted country. This is the moment to be saying, okay, we need to be doing our independent DSA, and then we will have a conversation and a negotiation. Obviously, there would be a negotiation, right? But that's something that, it wouldn't be unusual, and I think the opportunity is there, and I think really it's up to the government to be making use of that opportunity. I mean, that's how I would put it, because if you don't, I think the risks of us defaulting is seriously high otherwise.
I mean, it was high already.
Anyway, exactly, but this is just kind of increase that risk further.
Absolutely.
That would be another argument to put to the IMF as to why we need an independent DSA done that kind of considers all of the climate shocks or any kind of external shocks into account.
I mean, I think several months ago, the IMF put out a statement in which it described the situation as being on a knife's edge.
That's right.
So now we've sort of had Hurricane Ditwa coming and pushing us off that edge, in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And so it stands to reason that things are significantly worse for the economy and our debt repayment prospects than they were
and the
before.
people of the country.
Yes.
We really can't forget them, right? Because
it all comes down to that.
Yeah, I mean, like what? Some 2 million people are affected.
2.3 million, according to the UNDP report.
Yeah. So, 2 million people are affected. Of these, nearly half are children. Or there's 1.2 million people who require humanitarian assistance. Nearly half of these are children. So, the people are, this is a pretty vulnerable state for the country to be in. I mean, the UNDP before Cyclone Ditwa, this was after the debt crisis, said 52% of people in our country face multiple vulnerabilities. All of this would have just simply heightened, escalated in this moment, at this moment, right? In this past,
Now, Professor Kanchana, after the tsunami of 2004, you did a lot of research on the post-tsunami situation.
Yeah.
How do you compare that post-tsunami situation to the post-cyclone situation?
So I can talk about this more generically, but also using the post-tsunami as a point of departure, because I haven't really done research post-cyclone other than what I'm reading from the various reports and the newspapers. So in the tsunami, far more people were affected. There were far more lives lost, but the damage to the physical infrastructure was mostly limited to the coastline.
Right.
In this case, almost the entire country has been affected, and the damage to the physical infrastructure is the greatest. I mean, the president himself has acknowledged this, right? And that is one big difference. One of the other things which mattered then and also matters now, often in climate disasters, that there are gendered impacts. Women are affected by disasters much more. This is captured by the World Bank's report, the GRADE report as they call it, which is the Global Rapid Post-Disaster Damage Estimation, where they point out, in the case of Sri Lanka, more women are affected, more households headed by women or older people are affected, and children are affected. So there are gendered impacts, right? That's the similarity over both time period, both kind of events, right? And of course, and also in the social science debates, and certainly amongst geographers, there's argument there's nothing called a natural disaster. Often climate disasters become, or climate events become disasters because of the lack of preparation or the fact that the social infrastructure hasn't accounted for all these various ways, in differentiated ways in which communities are affected by climate events, right? And we've seen this unfold. So the similarity, I guess, would be the gendered impacts, which the World Bank's GRADE report kind of notes as well, that the impacts are gendered. It actually talks about Kandy and Nuerelia, where nearly 2 in 4 households who are headed by women or older people are affected by Cyclone Ditwa, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the World Bank report says that there's a damage of 4.1 billion.
That's right.
But 40% of that is in 3 districts, Kandy, Putlam and Badulla.
So, it's also concentrated.
Very concentrated. Yeah. So and these are districts which contribute very significantly to the economy.
That's right, with tea.
Kandy, Putlam,
sure.
In terms of agriculture,
right.
Tea exports, garments, and so on. So they're really significant districts, and highly populated ones as well. Yeah,
that's right, densely populated. And the other thing, I mean, this is the ILO estimate, which talks about up to 374,000 workers are affected, with potential income loss of at least $48 million per month, right? Not for the year, but per month, right? So this is a significant impact on communities, right? To lose that amount of livelihoods. So they underline the need for strengthening social protection in the longer term, coming up with short-term and medium-term provisioning. And I have to give credit to the government in that I have been speaking to a few workers who are sometimes migrant workers, and they have families in Ratnapura and areas which have been affected by Dade in Kandy, affected by Cyclone Ditwa, and they have talked about the fact that at the moment the Grama Sevakas seem to be on the ground and responding to households that have been affected by landslides, the effect on agriculture. I think there's a lack of clarity as to what kind of catastrophe is getting what kind of payment. But on the ground, I would say there's still some amount of trust in that the government will deliver. What I think the kind of disjuncture is that there's that trust, but there's none of them are really sure about, or none of them are aware of, what are the financial cost of this, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what's very hard to quantify, because of course there'll be more and more reports coming out of research, and the situation will become clearer as we go along. But we need to act now in terms of doing a DSA and renegotiating and getting
that would be
better
one.
terms.
That would be one. The other would be, speaking of responding to communities and the gendered impacts, I would really hope. I mean, I was quite it was disconcerting for me when I read the news after Cyclone Ditwa, when this management committee for rebuilding Sri Lanka was 100% men. So obviously it was as if there was no awareness of the gendered impacts of disasters. It was also, there were 4 representatives from the government, all men. The rest of them were all from the business sector, but with a mandate which is supposed to be identifying priorities, identifying strategic needs, in a fairly wide mandate given. And I found it a little bit, like, where are the engineers? Where are the, environmental scientists? Where are the gender specialists? Where are the where are the environmental people? I found that committee a little bit kind of disconcerting. And I kind of wondered, why is that the government, came up with a committee that's so narrow in a sense, right? And this is, when you have these opportunities, we should be thinking about, we need to be thinking about, using it in a way that really is about promoting the interests of the wide spectrum of society.
Inclusivity.
Right? Inclusivity. And also, during that time on social media, many people were pointing to the fact that, the government comes across as being earnest about tackling corruption. And yet it has created a committee of exclusively business people, right? Where you kind of open the possibility of conflict of interest to arise, which means, corruption could be coming in the back door. But that comes from a committee that has been formed by a government, which, on its mandate, it has one of the most kind of, certainly as a feminist scholar for me, I found this, it had a imagery of the various work that women did. So it went from the productive sphere to what we call the social reproductive sphere. So if it has that cognizance, then it needs to show that in practice, right? And that management committee is one, for instance. I was like, oh, there's a disjuncture here. And I don't know enough of the politics of why it took place, but it's certainly we need to be questioning that. And then, the businesses also have vested interests. And it's not as if the business community in this country or the private sector or the corporate sector are, it's not as if they're not blemished by some of the scandals of the past. The bond scam, the sugar scam, this involved the private sector. So our private sector also need to be reforming, right? And so, there needs to be serious conversations even amongst the business community. Can the status quo continue? Is it even going to be benefiting business community in the long term, right? But these are conversations that I'm hoping we kind of continue, because it's not just about the government. To me, it's about a wide spectrum of community interests, right? People's interests. And in the end, it is really about, delivering to the people, not to a few, but really to a larger segment of the population of this country.
In the end, it is all about people. We must never forget that. And I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura for joining us once again. It was lovely having you. And I'm sure in a few months' time we will have you once again to come and discuss the latest of what's going on. And now, thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.
And thank you for having me.